Hey everybody, Greg here, and this is a short video showing you my first woodworking project since I was a kid. And basically what I'm doing here is I have a piece of wood that's started. Here's what I'm starting out with is a piece of spruce, edge glued spruce. It's 1 inch by 12 inches by 36 inches. And actually I can use this one piece of wood for two projects. And so all I've done right now is I've just taken this hand saw here, and this is the Stanley Fat Max, there you go, hand saw, and sawed just straight through that piece of wood there. And it's a little rough, you know. In fact, I was getting some advice from the person at the hardware lumber store, and they were saying, oh, you should get an electric saw and a bench and all that stuff. And I thought, you know, it's okay to have it a little bit rough for the project I'm working on. So that smaller piece of wood is 22.5 inches long. I'm going to set that aside. I'm just going to use that actually as just a shelf. There's a bookshelf where I needed one extra shelf. So, but that's really, I guess, the scrap in this project. So the main project is going to be using this extra piece of wood, which I just went ahead and kind of broke along the seam, just used my hands to break that. No karate chop needed, just, you know, snapping it like that. And with the rougher edge where that break was, I'm just taking my pocket knife, and kind of smooth that edge off, whittled it down. And so now what I want to do is I want to make a base for just a little box. And it's a popular tradition for many people is to have like a little charity box where you just put money in there and you give that money toward some good cause, you know. So I wanted to have one of these that I built on my own. I just thought that would be kind of neat to have my sort of putting my whole body into it, you know, building a project by hand, kind of put more yourself into something. And this year I had kind of a revitalized enthusiasm for working with wood because I kept encountering a number of projects where somebody needed to have, let's say, a computer display lifted up or a little hutch underneath, you know, for maybe a desk, place to put their mouse, keyboard, whatever. And then there are other things just around the house where I might want to have a bookshelf, what you might call a floating shelf, you know, anchored on the wall. There's just a lot of stuff you can do when you have just a few tools and you're able to work with wood. So anyway, I'm going to step this project along here. I'm going to start with this base, and I have what is really just, it looks like a tailor's measuring tape. That's all I'm using. And I have a pen that I'm going to use to mark this wood up, which I did use when I wanted to cut that 22.5 inch piece. I wanted to have a little bit lined up and cut that, and I can sand it down or use my pocket knife on that, although going against the grain's a little tricky. So maybe just sanding that down. So I want to make a square for the base of this little charity box, and just kind of measuring this off here. So it looks like it broke at about 6.5 inches. So I'm going to measure about 6.5 inches going this way. That was one thing I wanted to do also, is as much as possible just use really rudimentary tools, you know, not be investing a lot of money and space into this, but focusing on some really simple woodworking projects. And you know, if you're okay with not necessarily having a garage full of tools, if you're okay with just having a few simple tools, you can still do a lot of projects. There's a tendency, I think, for people to really dive into something, and that's fine. You know, for those that do have the time and money to do that, that's great. But I think it ends up being a barrier, is what I'm saying. You know, if people feel like, oh, I can't get into woodworking, I don't have the space to put a big bench, I don't have the money for the tools. So anyway, I guess that's partly for this video. The reason for this video is to kind of encourage people to think about doing this as well. Just start with something simple. I mean, that bookshelf is that is just a scrap, but it's the right measurement for this particular wooden bookshelf that I have already. I need an extra shelf for. So that hardly qualifies as an actual wood project. But I really wanted the first thing that I worked on to be this charity box, because you know, it's sort of like you take your first effort. Let's say you're getting into music or whatever it might be, and you want to put that towards some good cause, you know. So anyway, that's the principle. But now that this is marked, I'm just going to kind of cut it along the edge here. And without having a bench, it makes it a little bit tricky, but not impossible, to get a clean cut. So I'm going to edit the tape later, edit the video later, and I'm going to go cut this and I'll come right back. So. Here are the other pieces to this. I'm going to change my strategy here. What I've decided to do is make this a little narrower. And one of the reasons I like snapping the wood off is it's just quick. Usually it's a pretty clean, straight cut, and it creates sort of a rough edge on there that you can either, you know, whittle down or just leave as is. It gives the final project a little bit more of a, you know, rustic look. And some of that I think I'm going to sand down. So I have a clean cut here. This is an original edge, and so is this. So I'm starting with kind of a narrow piece here. And this was a clean break on this side, so I can kind of work with that. And then taking these pieces, I'm going to go ahead and do the same with another one of these pieces of wood here. That one was a little bit more difficult. Yeah, I find that that hand saw ends up being, it leaves kind of a rough edge where it's been, where the wood's been sawed there. So, all right. So now working with these pieces, I can take this relatively flush edge here, that can go at that end. Then this piece can go here, and that sets smoothly. And then it looks to me like this piece would work well both at this end and at the other end. And it would be the right height. So I'm going to take this and cut it in half, and I'll use my measuring tape to get the halfway mark on that. 6.5, so we'll say 3 1/4. Can't seem to find that pen, so I'm just going to mark this with a thumbnail imprint. Really just need a spot to get started, and then make sure I have a clean cut. I have a clean edge here anyway, and actually a clean edge on this side, so hopefully that middle cut will be clean, and if not, I'll just sand it down a little bit. All right. So, I think we're most of the way there. So now I have what I think will be the back piece to this and the front piece, and then these sides, which I'll put in here. And I'm trying to decide, if I want to use small nails, screws, glue. I'm going to figure that out here in a minute, but for now I've got the basic outline of this. And it seemed to line up pretty well, actually. Yeah, there we go. So now I just need some sort of a top. And what I'm thinking about doing is possibly using this as the top and having another front piece to this. So for that, I'm going to look at making another break in one of these pieces of wood here. All right, so I've taken this piece, sawed that at the mark line that I put on there, and that will allow either a low rising front or a little bit taller front piece. I need to sand that down a little bit on these edges. Yeah, that's going to work. In fact, I think I have a better top piece now. Yeah, that's framed in nicely. And then I end up with two little scraps left over, which can be used for some other project. Now, what you saw previously then was taking a larger piece of wood, which this piece right here is 25.5 inches. I'm going to have that trimmed down. I have some sandpaper here. I'm going to just kind of clean it off a little bit, clean off those rough edges. And then the other pieces of wood that are really actually for the project itself are here. And some of those I used a saw to trim down, and others I just broke with my bare hands. Now that sounds kind of rugged, like something Chuck Norris would do, but actually if you have some wood like this that's glued along a seam, you can kind of push it against a corner and break it pretty easily. So anyway, but that gave me my base, which is a larger piece, and then these other pieces, which are going to be side pieces, and I'm going to be sanding those down today too, because on the sides where that was broken, or sides where I used a saw, it's pretty rough, and I want that to be a little bit smoother. The edges that are coming in contact with other pieces of wood, where I might be using some wood glue, those I might leave rough. I still haven't decided about that yet. Otherwise, if I'm using nails or screws, I may not need to have as much of a rough surface to absorb the glue. So I'm going to put my glasses on because it's just super sunny today. In our area, there is a Menards store. And so Menards is a great place to go for tools and other things you might need for projects. So I found this sandpaper that it almost feels kind of rubbery, and it has a shiny surface. It must be some sort of a plastic or rubber that's a 3M product, and it's just called 3M Sandblaster. This is the 220 grit, and so that's a fine grit, but it actually, what you do is you start with a very rough or coarse grit sandpaper to do some of the heavy surface work, and then you'll go from that to a finer grain sandpaper, because at that point you don't want scratches in the surface. You really want to polish that wood down, right? Well, the nice thing about this sandpaper is that it doesn't tend to deteriorate the way traditional sandpaper deteriorates. It doesn't crack, you know, it's not that thick paper, so it's not going to crack. It forms well around different surfaces, and it doesn't lose the surface, you know, sand essentially of the sandpaper. The grit is not lost. So anyway, it makes it an ideal sandpaper, I think, for this kind of project, because I can start with this, I can finish with this. It really clears the surface quickly. I'm going to go ahead and put on a face mask because there's going to be a lot of dust flying up. Now, I don't know why, but you know, there are a lot of folks that work with wood, and I don't know if it's a machismo thing or whatever, but you know, people that do any kind of construction and they don't want to wear protective eyewear, they don't want to wear earplugs, they don't want to wear a face mask, and you're really kind of asking for trouble, you know, if you don't wear protective gear. And you might think, well, that's not a lot of dust in the air, but it adds up, you know. So anyway, this sandpaper is really doing its job. And once I get these pieces sanded down, then I'm going to work on putting this little box together. Now, it depends on what kind of a finish you want on your project. If you want, you know, a very smooth product, final product, you may not want to use the method I did where that wood was actually broken, but I'm looking for that kind of, it's almost like driftwood appearance on here. It's just very worn down. That's what I'm wanting, is just natural, a natural break there to that wood. I'm not sure if I'm going to use any kind of wood finish or stain on here. I'm thinking about just letting it have kind of a natural appearance. Haven't totally decided on that yet, but here's another break at this edge. A little bit too much of a ridge on that, so I'm just going to break that off with a thumbnail. And you know, one thing I like about approaching a project this way is that you don't have to feel like, oh, it has to be perfect, you know, when you're done with it, or it has to be totally complete, you know, that I could add stain later, I could decide to paint it at some point, you know. Whatever I decide to do, it's always going to be kind of a work in progress. And I guess that's an approach that I've learned from the work that I do designing websites and working with people on their websites, is you kind of learn that it's a work in progress. Websites are. It's always going to be new approaches to design and implementation and new ways of presenting content on the web, you know. And so I like to look at projects that way. It's a little bit less stressful too, because you don't feel like it's got to be just perfect at any one point. Alright, so I'm going to finish this up and then we'll come back and look at the assembly of all of this. As I mentioned previously, I like to use non-conventional approaches, techniques, tools for doing the woodwork. And this is one example, setting some sandpaper on your leg, running the wood across that. It's kind of like having a sandpaper block, you know, one of these blocks that you put sandpaper on, you move it, but the leg, you know, having that softer surface really helps give it kind of a smooth, rounded edge. And it's a little bit easier than, you know, than holding the wood and moving that back and forth. So here you can see I have a bookshelf that's open on top, and that's what this 25.5-inch board is for. And thankfully it is really lining up nicely on either edge. Now it's going to just slide around and be loose if I don't put some sort of anchoring in place. Now I don't really have to have a lot of heavy hardware holding that in place. In fact, what I plan to do is put some screws underneath and actually drive them in just about all the way, so that if this shelf tries to move, if it gets bumped or whatever, it will be framed in on either side by those screws. And that's going to give me now a nice top shelf here for this bookshelf that's sturdy and it kind of fits in place nicely. So I wanted to wrap up this first of perhaps many woodworking project videos, and I have the little box here. It's only gently held together by some adhesive tape on the inside. I'm still kind of working through what I want the actual hardware to be that's going to hold this together. What I'm thinking about is using some stiff metal wire and running it through almost like you would with a nail or with a screw to hold it together, and having what would look like kind of a starter hole using a very small, fine drill bit, making a channel for that wire to go through. And the advantage of that would be that it would keep this held together pretty snugly, but I could also pull those metal wires out and then reassemble it differently or work on it if I want to paint it or finish it further in a certain way. It would let me take it apart, put it back together, for just kind of ongoing care or changes to the design if I want to, paint it and then strip that paint later. It just makes it a lot easier to work on. I don't have to worry about kind of the rough holes that you end up with screws. So anyway, that's my thinking at this point. Also, I'm not yet sure, if I want the top to be hinged or not. And if I do, maybe I'll use wires to accomplish that as well. I've also thought about turning the one end or the other into like a little door and have a tiny door handle or knob there. So essentially that would be hinged. And again, using these wires as the hinge in the bottom and the top, forming that together. So anyway, it gives me some versatility using the wire instead of screws or nails. And then, at each end, to be able to pull that wire out again, I would probably loop it or create a small wound bundle of wire there. And that could also form, if those are on the bottom, could help form some feet to this. So this would sit up a little bit on that wound wire. So anyway, a work in progress. So maybe I'll post some pictures or a follow-up video later. But thanks for watching this first project, and appreciate all the comments, suggestions, feedback. Always good to get. So have a great day.